Hello. It would hardly be a complete course about ethics without considering some foundational and fundamental texts for a substantial part of the world that have served for centuries in as a basis or grounds for people's conception of ethics. It would hardly be complete to do an ethics course without mentioning these. These are, of course, the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. It's quite a difficult topic for a number of reasons. One of them is because people have such different relations to these texts. Relationships with these texts can be that much more difficult to recognize the elephant, so to speak, or to be able to perceive the way in which all of these different viewpoints contribute something to the whole, but none of them is by itself the essence of what we're trying to encounter in its entirety. It also can be quite difficult because, especially up until this point in the course, we have been encountering texts about ethics that are written in an attempt at theoretical precision and kind of enumerating and delineating and articulating concepts of ethics. It's clear that, in some ways, this way of thinking about morality or ethics is somewhat anomalous in human history. And I mentioned that before, that almost in all traditional cultures that we know of, ethics has been largely a question of what's been passed on through stories and through role models and through stories that we learn from our forebears. That being said, I think that what we have covered until now in ethics can help us to shed light on some of these views, more ancient views. Specifically, again, in this lecture, I will be talking about conceptions of ethics as they are expressed in the Old and New Testaments. In fact, there are two, not exactly contradictory, but very distinct expressions of ethics or conceptions of ethics that can be found in comparison between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'll try to explain and present how we can think of these and how they compare to one another, how they're similar, and also how they're different. And in fact, I'm going to try to show how they are related to each other in a sort of metamorphosis, and it's almost a question of an inversion or a revolution or a turning around of something. Again, I'll try to explain what I mean. I hope by the end of the lecture that's a little bit more clear. As my representative samples or expressions of these two views of ethics, these two theories of ethics, I will use from the Old Testament. I will use as the representative expression the famous Ten Commandments that Moses iconically received on Mount Sinai, as recounted in the book of Exodus. He received this tablet of stone, and the law, the Ten Commandments of the Jewish law, are written on this tablet for everyone to abide. As my expression of ethics in the New Testament, I will use this again iconic moment of Jesus going up and on top of the mountain for the Sermon on the Mount, the famous the blessings, blessed are the poor in spirit, etc. And I will try to show how the relationship, the continuity between these two views of ethics, but also the radical transformation that the Old Testament law undergoes in the New Testament with the revelations and the teachings of Jesus. And then again, just to emphasize, I also, in exploring this question, I'm going to try to use what we've covered up until this point in this course, the theoretical frameworks of ethics, to try to situate both of these views and again establish a continuity with what we've studied until now. So that's something of a tall order, but I hope that at least by the end of this video that something I've said helps to stimulate further discussion or insights or whatever the value of this may be. And so to begin with, we can take one of the Ten Commandments. I believe it's the sixth commandment. This is kind of famously, thou shalt not kill. It's a very unequivocal statement. And again, it's written in a tablet of stone. And everyone sort of recognizes this as the law of the land, the law of the people. Right? Now, I chose this commandment because in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus explicitly references this commandment. And what he does with it is quite interesting, and I also think it demonstrates, or it's expressive of the kind of transformation that our understanding of, or that the understanding of morality undergoes with the teachings of Jesus. So again, we have the Ten Commandment expression, thou shalt not kill. It's very clearly, to relate it to what we've studied until now, it's very clearly an example of something like divine command theory, right, where it's clear that these are the laws of God and the people abide by them. It's also something of a deontological view of ethics, where it's a sort of uncompromising question of duty, and it's your duty to abide the Ten Commandments. And it's very clear. It's a very clear delineation between what is moral and what is immoral. Straying from the Ten Commandments, breaking the Ten Commandments, trespassing the Ten Commandments is again a moral transgression. Jesus does something very interesting with, and most explicitly with this sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And just to quote Jesus, he says, "Ye have heard that it was said of them in old time." And so he's again explicitly referring to the law of Moses. He says, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill. And whosoever shall kill be in danger of judgment. But I say unto you," Jesus continues, "I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, you shall be at the council, whosoever shall say, thou fool, the same shall be in danger of judgment." In other words, what I read in what Jesus is saying is, and again, I think this is somehow representative of Jesus' teaching. He takes the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," which is it's a sort of clearly external. It's a rule with an external referent. "Thou shalt not kill." It's a proscription. It tells people what not to do externally. Jesus does something, and it's a sort of inversion, or turning inwards. And he says, even if you have when we think of murder, killing somebody, it's clearly it doesn't just come out of the blue. It's rather it's our deed is an expression of a motive we have. This again will be familiar from prior weeks of study in this course. We never just do things for no reason. There's always a motive or an impulse behind it. And what I see Jesus doing is directing or kind of referring people to this the source of the motive, or the source of the action. He's saying basically you've already when you to kill is an expression of anger, and Jesus is really turning people inward to recognize rather than the effect, rather than the consequentialist aspect of the ethics. He's referring them inwardly to the source, or the kind of the original impulse behind something. And so he says, "Whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment." Now we should say, what kind of judgment is this? It's clearly not a legal judgment, because you can't exactly mete out legal judgment upon motives or upon thoughts, right? And so when we think of judgment, again, we have to think of something kind of something psychological rather than legal. At this point, it might be actually helpful to introduce another spiritual teacher from not exactly contemporary with Jesus, but ancient, lived several centuries before Jesus, historically speaking. This is, I'm thinking of the Buddha, and there's a famous parable about a famous record of one of the Buddha's, I guess it's a parable, that I think can shed light on what Jesus is trying to say here. The Buddha famously compares holding a grudge against someone or being angry with someone. He compares that to carrying around a hot coal in your pocket, ready to sort of cast it at the person when you encounter them. Now, obviously, in the meantime, the ember it's burning a hole through your pocket, and probably a lot worse than that. So, in other words, the anger itself. How would I say this? You don't have to. The anger itself, holding the anger itself, is its own. Its own punishment. In other words, if we think of, we can think of like the social body, the external society that we live in. That's one aspect of our lives. There's another complementary aspect though, and that is our own kind of psychological inner life. And when our inner life is sort of colored with anger at our fellow human beings, it might as well be. I mean, it's a sort of judgment on ourselves that we're carrying, or a sort of punishment that we carry by being permeated or flushed with anger. Again, I think Jesus is continually turning people's attention to their own consciousness, their own psychological life, and this I think it's a continual theme through all of, especially the Sermon on the Mount, but all of Jesus' teachings. He says, this again, it's a revolutionary, it's not a commandment, but it's an injunction. He says, I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good unto them that hate you. So we recall that, that sort of, especially as expressed in the dialogues of Plato, that a typical idea of ethics that I think Glaucon and Thrasymachus were espousing in the Republic was the idea of like, ethics means to help your friends and harm your enemies. And Socrates did something. He argued that that really with ethics we should harm no one. And he says because by harming someone you make them worse. Not only that. Not only do you make them worse, but you also make yourself worse, because you become the kind of person that does harm. And I think Jesus is taking this and he's intensifying it. He's kind of raising it to a higher power almost. Or he's again, it's like a higher octave of what Socrates first did to the kind of traditional conception, which is help your friends, harm your enemies. Socrates says harm no one. Jesus says love your enemies rather. Again, I think we can. It sounds radical and it sounds crazy, but at the same time, I think it's perfectly logical, because we can understand it as a question of, just de-emphasizing the external actions and emphasizing the inner state. The inner state that somebody has to carry in order to persecute somebody, perpetrate harm on another person. This is clearly a negative inner state. And again, I think over and over again, Jesus draws our emphasis to our inner states. He says again, for that what judgment ye judge, ye shall again be judged, and with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured upon you again. Again, this is a question of the way. If I'm a judgmental person, I'm also that's my exterior judgment, my judgment upon some other object. That's an expression of my inner state of being judgmental, right? And in other words, it's like Jesus is really taking. Plato introduced this idea, but that sort of injustice or vice is its own punishment, and virtue or justice is its own reward. Jesus basically takes that maxim from Socrates, and he intensifies it. And so it's you don't have to be vicious, to harm another person, to cast judgment on another person. that is its own. To do that is its own punishment, so to speak. He very famously, in the same Sermon on the Mount, he says. Again, he's referring to an old law. This is not exactly explicit in the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments, it's it's contemporary, roughly, with the Ten Commandments. I specifically think of Hammurabi's Law Code, which was another early code of ethics, legal code of ethics from the ancient Near East. It's famous for the phrase, an eye for an eye. And Jesus, again, he refers to this ancient law. He says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." But Jesus turns it around, which is to say, sort of turns it back upon itself, or turns it inward, and he says, "I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also." This is famous, turning the other cheek. This, again, it sounds kind of extremely radical, but again, I think we can understand it in a question of inner states. We become, by sort of, conflict is a question of two oppositional forces, right? Like a positive and a negative force are always well, you can't have conflict without this antagonism or opposition of forces. And again, Jesus is enjoining us to sort of refuse to enter into these conflicts. He continues in the same, turning the other cheek. He says, "If any man will sue at thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also." If someone asks you to walk a mile with them, walk 2 miles, he's asking people to really overcome their internal tendencies towards conflict. So much can be said about this, and I feel that it's in many ways it's way beyond what I'm able to, or the understanding this is way beyond. I suppose I should say it's no understanding of this could ever be complete, and so the most I can hope to do is just offer a few sort of a very sketch and some preliminary observations or remarks that maybe can stimulate further thought and further discussion. But I hope that I've given a couple pictures of how of the sort of the radically, but also the radical difference, but also the continuity between the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments as expressed in the Old Testament, which is an external code of ethics that people abide by, and the New Testament teaching of Jesus, which is it's a sort of attentiveness to our inner state, right, and ensuring that our inner state is as pure as can be. And this clearly is a question of sort of very conscientiousness and consciousness of our inner state. Jesus, though, he's adamant that he's not departing from the old law. He's not rejecting the old law. He's not obviating it. He's not negating it. He says, "Do not think that I come to destroy the law of Moses, or the prophets." He sees his teaching as a fulfillment of it. There's maybe it's perhaps somewhat of a tangent, but it also could be a sort of a key to this whole sort of archetypal transition that the conception of ethics undergoes between the Torah and the New Testament, and that is in the term, in English it's often found it's the term repent, made famous by John the Baptist. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent. We think of repent as something like remorse. but it's quite it's the repent is of course an English translation of a word that was not originally written in English. In fact, the word was written in Greek, and the Greek word is metanoia. This word, it's extremely expressive, probably more expressive than the word repent. And metanoia actually means something like a sort of conversion of the mind, or a conversion of the heart, conversion of the mind. It's a sort of turning about. A turning about of the maybe intellectual conversion is a good word for it. Spiritual conversion, intellectual conversion. And so this word repent, if we understand, it's almost technical language, in the way like a mechanical engineer or a neurosurgeon would have to learn very careful technical language for his field. There's a sort of technical language with these texts, and repent is a perfect example of one of those words that has a very specific meaning that we might not recognize unless we are familiar with the language of these texts. If we think of repent as again turning about of the heart, intellectual conversion, then I think it would be very clear how I think the metamorphosis that the Ten Commandments undergo in their transition to the Sermon on the Mount will be very clear. Again, it's a sort of turning about, turning inside out. St. Paul very famously compares, he very famously writes in one of his letters that henceforth the law of Moses, it shall be inscribed on your hearts. And so the idea is, in the old times it was a tablet of stone that the law was inscribed. The new way is for the law to be inscribed in your own heart. That's of course figurative language. It points to something like the source of our moral impulses. In the one case, the source of our moral impulses is an imposition from outside of us. Again, it's following the rules. We've traced something like this in our course up until this point, where we talked first about codes of ethics, just like in any business or something, that you just follow the codes. They're like rules that you follow. We moved to utilitarianism, which is a consequentialist ethic, but it's based on a principle that is at least intelligible to us, if not really practical. We then moved to Kantian ethics, which was a clear sort of, I'm making a gesture, but it's a kind of, it's coming closer to us. It's an inwardization, because with Kantian ethics, we are our focus, our emphasis is changed from the effect or the consequence or the outcome of an action to the impulse or the motive or the will that was the source of that action. We moved to Aristotelian virtue ethics. We saw that for Aristotle, ethics was much more an expression of character traits, and so character virtues and vices, which are traits of character. Again, this is I picture it as one step closer to our selves, or our eyes, our selves. With Rudolf Steiner, we saw in some way trying to really apprehend this ethical impulse from its very incipient origin, the very center of the self, and in this sort of consciousness of freedom as the ground of ethics. I think we see a very similar, in some way, on this transformation or this traverse. It's kind of established and measured by or maybe typified, but the boundaries are typified by the law of Moses on one side, and the Sermon on the Mount, the fulfillment of that law on the inside. Again, as a sort of a question of something, a question of external versus internal origin of our ethical impulses. And by external and internal, I don't exactly mean this is metaphorical language. It's using spatial terms. And so, when we say the law is inscribed in your heart, clearly we don't mean the heart as an organ. We mean the heart as the kind of very central core of our being. And so this is similarly when we say external and internal, I'm pointing internally like this, but that's a metaphor for something that's rather internal to the mind or internal to the soul, which are not exactly spatial things. But again, I think this might sound, to somebody, this might sound strange or esoteric, unbelievable maybe, to somebody just coming from, to somebody without the basis of this course up until now. But again, I think that drawing on the theories and drawing on what we've covered up until this point, I think we have sort of cultivated in ourselves the theoretical and intellectual tools that actually enable us to perceive more in a text like the Old and New Testaments, to perceive more in them than we might have been able to before having approached ethics from these other more theoretical standpoints. That's probably a good place to stop. I've probably said enough and maybe more than enough. I invite I invite and I welcome any comments or discussions, and I look forward to carrying on these thoughts further. On that note, I will end the lecture, but not before wishing everyone the very best, and until next time.